Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Jack's Corner. I'm Tarzan Bonanno, and with me, as always, is our founder, Jack Figgle. Today, Jack wants to overview Kallistos and his lectures. So, we just finished his mystical theology lectures. We're into Robert Taft now. So, Jack, how do you want to do this? Which story do you want to begin with?
Well, I thought I'd start with how the first Kallistos lecture series came about, as best as I can recall, and when, and how that led into all the rest, and what the rest means, and what we have in store for our listeners coming down the pike in terms of future podcasts. How's that sound?
Sounds good to me, Jack.
All right, good. Well, as I think our listeners have heard from me, that Metropolitan Kallistos of Dioclea just passed away last year, and has been involved with Orientale Lumen conferences since the very first one in 1997. So that's now almost getting to 30 years. We had our 27th conference this past June on Zoom, virtual. Hopefully in 2024, we're going to be able to go back to in-person as people are willing to travel and meet together now that the pandemic has not disappeared, but it's a lot less dangerous than it used to be. And we all, as a society, need to get on with life, so to speak. So the first formal lecture series that everyone has been listening to from the beginning of our podcasting was called The Mystical Theology of the Fathers. And it was recorded, according to my notes, in 2009. So some 13, 14 years ago, almost 15 years ago, at His Grace's sitting room in his residence in Oxford. I was on a trip to someplace else in Europe. I can't remember exactly where, probably Rome. And I stopped off in England to visit with him for a day or two. And I had my video cameras with me for whatever my other trip, the other part of my trip was for. And I suggested to His Grace that I stop and spend a few days recording lectures that he had given at Oxford University for courses that he used to teach. He taught all sorts of Eastern Christian subjects at Oxford for almost 40 years before he retired, and was quite well known, of course, across the globe for his various English language books, the translation work he did on things like the Philokalia and prayer services for the Orthodox Church. And his most widely read book, The Orthodox Church, was published over 50 years ago now and is still in print with Penguin Books. It's the only book of the series on all of the churches of the world that they did 50 years ago that is still in print. And from the last statistics he told me, they sell over 1,000 copies a year.
Shows the reach of Kallistos.
Yes. And there was one lecture that I arranged for him in Washington some years ago, in which the Metropolitan of the Orthodox Church in America, Metropolitan Jonah, it came and introduced His Grace at a parish to give 3 talks on the Jesus Prayer. And in the introduction, he held up the Orthodox Church book and asked the congregation how many there were Orthodox because of it. In other words, they converted to Orthodoxy because of that book. And half of the parish, or half of the congregation that was there, put their hands up. And there were about 200 people filling the church. Half of them put their hands up as having converted to Orthodoxy because of that book, including the Metropolitan himself. He put his hand up as well. And so, yes, Metropolitan Kallistos, I think, can be attributed to having tens of thousands of people discover Orthodoxy and become Orthodox because of that book and all of his other writings. So it was a great honor for us to get him involved in the Orientale Lumen conferences from the beginning in 1997. But in 2009, some 14, 15 years after we started the conferences, as I said, I was on a trip. I had my cameras with me, and I suggested that we record lectures that he gave on some topic. And he picked the mystical theology of the fathers, the Eastern Fathers. Patristics is also the term that's used.
Fun course.
Sorry?
I said it's a fun course.
Yes.
Because I'm a convert to Catholicism, had to take patristics, still have my book on that chair over there. So.
All right. Well, then if you took a course or part of a course on patristics, you may know more about it than I do because I was born and raised Byzantine Catholic and never had to go study it.
No, I'm here for a reason.
Yeah. So the mystical theology of the fathers was the topic that he chose. And I showed up with my cameras and we arranged the furniture in his sitting room so that his sitting chair was in front of his library of books. And I set up 3 cameras from different angles and sat in front of him. And he just sat there with his notes on his lap and just started giving me a one-on-one lecture on each of the topics for that first series, all about the various fathers that he taught and what their theology was, what their teachings were. And we ended up with 10 different lectures. He actually organized them in his own mind as to what saint was going to be covered by what lecture. I didn't have to do hardly any design work other than just record him and then edit the videos with the different angles. So it wasn't a boring just head talking, but you got to see different things. And that's what we made available. And people have been watching it ever since in various forms and now listening to it on our podcast. And that's how the first one came about, was me sitting in his sitting room in Oxford with cameras rolling, and he gave me a one-on-one lecture. It was quite an honor and privilege.
Did you sit there with your own notepad, just like? Yes.
No. I just sat there and tried to keep from falling asleep because that would have been a terrific insult. But he was engaging as usual, and so there was no chance of that. But that's how the first one started, and so for the last 10 years until his health declined and he was unable to do them, about once a year in my travels, I would stop in Oxford and sit with him and do another topic. And he would tell me over and over again that these were topics that he would pull notes out of the file that he had in his bedroom, which were the notes from his classes, that he said he never would have time to write them formally into essays or into books.
Yes.
And that he was so happy to be able to record them for posterity and capture his knowledge and views on these subjects. So some people over the years have told me that they're very thrilled. Not only do they have their wisdom, but because we have them in video, you can get a sense of his personality. You get to see the twinkle in his eye when he talks about certain of the saints. The one I remember in particular was Saint Seraphim of Sarov, a Russian saint that he had a particular devotion to. And he had so many details about Saint Seraphim's life in Russia that it was just a pleasure. It was more of a biography than anything else that he was able to explain to me and tell all of our listeners who Saint Seraphim was, what he taught, how he came to the faith, and all those sorts of things. So it was quite exciting. There were a few times when I would have a trip scheduled, and again, on a few occasions they were on my way somewhere else, and I would be in touch with him, and he would say, well, what subject do you want me to talk about this time? And I said, well, whatever you want to talk about. He said, no, no, no. What do you want to talk about? And we'd go back and forth a few times. And finally, I'd either come up with an idea and then he'd modify it, or he'd say, oh, yes, yes, I can talk about that subject, or he'd suggest something. So the subjects that he specifically recorded with me, if I can just maybe list them as titles and the topics that people will hear in future podcasts from him. We started with mystical theology. Let's see, I think the next one in sequence was Heaven on Earth, the Inner Meaning of the Eucharist. It was his understanding and teachings about what we do when we go to liturgy, not the history of liturgy, the way Taft talks about it, or the rubrics of liturgy, or the scriptures found in liturgical texts, any of the academic subjects. His was a very patristic set of lectures explaining what we experience in liturgy and how the inner meaning of what the Eucharist is and why we go to church, essentially. And it's really a foundation of the faith, and so it was a wonderful set of lectures. I think one of my favorites. So that was sort of the second group. The third was I went through the number of years of his talks at Orientale Lumen on all sorts of subjects, and I just put them together as a package of talks called Ecumenical Reflections. Those were not special recordings that I did in Oxford, but in fact, simply the recordings that we made at plenary sessions at the various Orientale Lumen conferences in Washington. We did one or two in Constantinople, but most of them were done in Washington. And I just put them together as a package of things that he spoke on that were of an ecumenical nature. The next in our series was 1 year, and I can't remember how it all got started, but he came to the Washington area in February at the start of Lent, the Great Fast. And it was because Orthodox parishes in the area kept asking me to try to get him to come visit their parish. And it was always too tight a schedule around the Orientale Lumen conferences because he would have other commitments elsewhere in the world. He would be able to just come in for the conference itself and leave immediately after it ended. And there was not a lot of time for him to go visit parishes. So he and I talked, and I told him that all the parishes in the area were anxious to have him come visit. They were willing to share in funding his travel expenses. And so we arranged for him to give lectures. And I think it was, 5 or 6 parishes of different Orthodox jurisdictions around Washington. And also we drove down to Richmond on that trip. And he also gave one talk at my parish, Byzantine Catholic Church. So we had all sorts of different talks in different parishes. So we have a package that's called Our Lenten Journey. And they were all of his talks about how we prepare for Lent and how we go through the Great Fast, what are the major topics and ways in which we pray and in which we study Scripture. Again, a very pastoral set of lectures and talks that I recorded at all the parishes.
How long did that one
One little
take? Like how many lectures you got in that series?
I think there are 6 or 7, and it took us about, I don't know, a week to 10 days to get them all done. He was doing almost, a different one in a different parish every day. We did have 2 days of travel in the schedule because we drove to Richmond and back, and I didn't want to overtire him or myself. And then we had a last minute complication that almost canceled the whole project in that it was a fluke here in Washington that we had what was called Snowmageddon. 3 feet of snow fell in about 3 days. And he arrived before the storm hit. And then I suggested to him that we drive down to Richmond a day early for the first parish visit and just sit around for an extra day in the hotel, allowing him to relax from jet lag. And it was a very, very good idea because the storm hit Washington while we were in Richmond. And by the time we drove back from Richmond, all the streets had been cleared around Washington, and we were able to keep the schedule as originally proposed. The only change we had to make was the opening lecture was supposed to be at my own parish, and we just pushed it back to the following week after the snow was cleared and before he flew home. So we didn't have to change planes, trips. We didn't have to adjust any parish visits except mine. And the good Lord was with us in our planning and execution of that project, because if it had been a day one way or the other, his plane would not have been able to land in the middle of a snowstorm. Mm-hmm. So that was quite an exciting trip. The next couple of topics were specific lecture series, and these were ones where I would fly to Oxford, to England, to London, for just that purpose. His lectures were becoming more and more popular. I felt they were becoming more and more important to capture as he grew older, and I decided it was worth both the time and the money to just fly to Oxford and spend 2 or 3 days with him recording a set of lectures. And I usually did them during Lent, and so they became my Lenten retreat of going to his residence, sitting in his sitting room, in his living room, and listening to him give me 5 or 6, 7 lectures on a particular topic. I would schedule myself into a bed and breakfast just around the corner from his residence in Oxford. I'd fly into Heathrow Airport, rent a car, drive up to Oxford, and spend 2, 3 days with him, have dinner with him, and then he would sit and do 3, sometimes 4 lectures in one day, just talking to me and the cameras rolling. It was really, really a great arrangement. I felt he seemed to enjoy it. And for each topic, he would come out with a sheaf or a manila folder of handwritten lecture notes from his bedroom filing cabinet, where he kept all his notes from his lectures. The topics that we covered in that group of recordings was one of I think the first one in the group was called The Mystery of the Church, which was all about ecclesiology. And I remember, I think the first lecture is called Why does the Church exist? And what I can remember, and I usually don't remember too much of the content because I just have trouble with that. But the one thing I remember from that series lesson that he taught was that the church, and us going to Eucharist in particular, is the only place where we can receive the grace of God through the sacraments, through the Eucharist. And you can have social groups, and you can have business groups. You can have all sorts of athletic groups and other groups and meetings and gatherings. But the church is the one unique place where we receive grace. And that's what makes it unique and special. And that was a powerful message. The next topic was the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. And so he was moving sort of through the main theological topics that we learned about our faith. So the doctrine of Holy Trinity was all about the Trinitarian nature of the focus of the Eastern churches is on the Trinity more so than on Christ. There's a particular story that he tells about three monks going to an island and what happens to them with regard to the Trinity. And I will let our listeners wait until that package comes out, those lectures, to get more details about that one.
Smart. Yeah.
It's a cute little story that it gives a real solid understanding of what the Trinity is all about. Then he moved into a sort of not a parallel, but a comparable topic, and that was Christology, which is the formal topic name. And it was a series of lectures on Christ, yesterday, today, and forever, and all the aspects of how Christ fits into our faith and fulfills the plan of salvation that God has in store for all of us. So there's a series of lectures about Christ. And of course, that followed on very quickly with a series of lectures about Mary and her feast days. So he goes through all of the feast days of Mary from her conception with St. Anne. And again, if you want to hear details about that, and he does explain the difference between Eastern and Western understanding of Mary and her conception, and how that fits in and influences East and West understanding of original sin, and which leads to understanding of baptism. So it all ties together, and he does a marvelous job of explaining it in a pastoral sense rather than a high academic sense. I mentioned earlier that he has a special devotion to Saint Seraphim of Sarov. And so one series, when I said to him, well, what do you want to talk about? And he said, I'd like to talk about Saint Seraphim this time. And so he gave me
a whole series
lectures
on him.
Yeah, there's a whole series on Saint Seraphim.
When's his feast day?
I'm not sure.
We'll figure out when his feast day is, and that's when we'll air that one.
Yeah,
the whole series will be on his feast day.
Yeah, there's 6 of them. And then going back to the fathers, he then also did a full series of explaining the Philokalia, which is a series of books of the writings of the fathers, of the Desert Fathers, that he has been working on his whole life to translate into English. The first 4 volumes came out relatively quickly together, but the 5th volume has taken him some 20 years to complete, and it was the last book that he completed and edited and was published before his passing last year. So the 5th volume of the Philokalia was his lifelong goal to translate and get published, and that was achieved before he passed away.
His literal life's work.
Yes, indeed. But he gave me a 5 or 6 lecture explanation of the Philokalia. He gave an introduction to it, explained where it comes from and its content and how important it is to the Eastern Church. And along those same lines, he did another series of lectures on the Jesus Prayer, which is a simple, easy to understand prayer that leads to what is known as hesychasm, which is a silent, quiet prayer, a meditation, and repeating the Jesus prayer. And for those who are familiar with it, using the prayer rope called a chutki, which, yep, you have. They come in different
I've got the wood one.
colors, yeah, different colors and materials and sizes, and it's you could consider it equivalent of the Roman rosary, um, but it's got a slightly different um, purpose and usage and more variety than more variety in one sense, but in another sense, because it's the same prayer over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, it's less variety than the rosary. So
Do you do the
it's just
short form, the medium form, or the long form of the Jesus prayer?
I use the Kallistos form
Which
in
is?
which he teaches just pray it every chance you get, any time of the day, and in any circumstance.
Okay, fair
And
enough. What I meant
and
was
yeah,
the form I do is a longer form. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I
yeah,
know that you
okay,
can get it shorter. And then
yeah,
Matt Frad, I think he actually does it. It's just Jesus, mercy. Jesus,
yeah,
mercy.
yeah, yeah.
But
So you can have all sorts of forms. The one that I use, and I think um, this is what he used in his lectures, and that's probably why I picked it up. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner.
yes,
The
the
liturgy,
medium form is what as I called it.
it's sort of a medium form. That's right. But the thing about the Jesus prayer, I remember from his lecture that I found, a little humorous, and it was intended that way. He said that we should pray the Jesus prayer every chance we get, and he said even when you're standing in an elevator going to your office, you could say it 3 or 4 times. When you're walking down the street or you're shopping in a supermarket. And then he ended and he said, and even when you're waiting for a bus, you can stand there and say the Jesus prayer over and over again until the bus arrives. And he concludes with saying, and here in Oxford, you can say the Jesus prayer an awful lot waiting on a bus.
I'll tell you right now. The Jesus prayer has helped me tremendously. And there's been many a times I'm driving and I'm just like, why am I holding this? It's way too big to be carrying around in my car, but I don't care. All 100 of these beads are getting the Jesus prayer as I'm going wherever I'm going. And while I did mess up all my prayers when I was on my flight to Alaska because there was horrible turbulence, I somehow managed to get a Jesus prayer out properly. Is the joke because I kept saying everything wrong. It was a bad turbulence.
Yeah. So there are two more lecture series that I'd just like to mention. One was he couldn't think of any topic to talk about. And so I suggested that we somehow get him to um, explain in a lecture form the contents of his book, The Orthodox Church.
So kind of
And
like
so,
a reverse of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity.
yeah,
He did the radio series first, and then the book, and this flipped.
yeah. So he wrote the book. Of course, when he wrote the book, he didn't intend to make it into a lecture or an audio podcast because when he wrote it 50 years ago, those things weren't even conceived of, let alone close to being available. So, and to avoid any copyright problems with Penguin Books, I called the series Churches of the Christian East rather than the Orthodox Church. And he did two favors for me in uh, giving those lectures. One was I asked him from the very beginning to explain that although what he was going to talk about was according to his own experience with the Orthodox Church, everything or almost everything that he talked about applied equally to the Eastern Catholic Byzantine churches. And he said that. He said, and he also went on to say ecumenically that the Eastern Catholics, are the Orthodox closest friend uh, because they are almost identical, and that therefore what he was going to teach and explain from his book, and it was not an audio book where he's sitting and reading the book. All I gave him was the outline of the table of contents, the chapter headings. He kept that outline on a table next to his chair, and he sat and spoke for an hour about every chapter off the top of his head. He just told me the book in 8 or 9 hours, and it was marvelous. So it was, you don't have to sit and read the book if you listen to the lectures. The other special series was, and this was his idea, that he wanted to speak of his own journey to becoming Orthodox and his own spiritual journey through his life. And so he gave me, I think it's only 5 lectures, but they are very intense and very special, that he explains the phases of his own life and his own spirituality.
Are you saying to me that Metropolitan Kallistos Ware is a convert?
Yes. Yes. He converted from being an Anglican to being Orthodox in his late teens, 17 or 18 or 19, something like that. And I think the story goes, and his lecture, I think, would give it in more detail. But I remember from what I can remember, that he was walking in London and he heard this miraculous sound of music, and he followed it into this small little tucked away Russian Orthodox church of what was then called the Synod, or the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, known as Rokor. And it was a small little church, and the singers were singing some service, probably Vespers, in the late afternoon. And he just fell in love with it. He talked to the priest, and over a period of time, he learned about the Orthodox Church. He studied it. He went to college at Oxford himself and studied patristics and Greek and English as an academic subject. But then he's converted to Orthodoxy. And the interesting part is, even though he first was introduced to Orthodoxy through this Russian Orthodox Church, because of his studies of patristics, the Russian Orthodox priest recommended that he pursue conversion in the Greek Orthodox Church rather than the Russian. And so it's one of the reasons he still, till the end of his days, had a close connection with the Russian Orthodox Church, even though he's part of the Ecumenical Patriarchate officially.
Yeah. So
and he spent his time trying to keep them together, which by the time he passed away, unfortunately, they were out of communion with each other because of Ukraine.
Yes. So kind of like a modern day Orthodox G.K. Chesterton.
Yeah. And the last part of the last lecture in his spiritual journey series, and this will be the last I'll talk about for now, was the last 10 minutes of the last lecture. He talked about his own personal preparation for death, because it was only a few years ago that we made these recordings, and he put on record how he was preparing for the end of his life. And as he explained and taught and, honestly believed, he said that the day that I pass from this life to the next is simply the first page of the next chapter of my life.
Memento Mori.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to that day with anticipation for the surprise that God has in store for me of what the next chapter of my life will be. He said, God is full of surprises, and that he looked at his coming death because by this time he was starting to suffer from various illnesses, cancer, and so forth, and diabetes. And he knew the end was coming. He was in his let's see, late 70s, and I think he died at 81 or 82. Um, but it was I was in tears, I have to say, listening to him, sitting there with the cameras rolling as he said these things. But it was helpful for me because it was the same time in which I was caring for my mother in her last days here at my house. And so his understanding and explanation of his coming death helped me a great deal in taking care of her and helping her with her own journey. So it was very moving for me, and it was I think a very special epitaph, if you will. And I believe I extracted those last 8 or 9 minutes of that lecture and provided it to the um, Fellowship of St. Sergius and St. Albans earlier this year when they had a tribute to Metropolitan Kallistos, and they showed that video to all the members. And he was the president of that fellowship. And they had a memorial service or a tribute to him in the spring, and I gave them that piece, that video clip, as uh, sort of a send off, and it was, like I said, a very moving explanation of death, and helped me a great deal. So those are the highlights. I think there are perhaps some topics that I missed, um, but it's a combination of Orientale Lumen conference plenary sessions, lectures to parishes around Washington, but mostly uh, lectures that he uh, explained to me or delivered to me sitting in his uh, living room, his city room, which is also his library. And I'll just maybe comment. The library is probably a fairly good sized room, maybe uh, 15 feet by 20 feet, sort of 5 by 7 meters or something like that, with very high ceilings, as an Oxford older house would have. Um, 12, 13-foot ceilings, much higher than a standard American house. But he had bookshelves custom made on 3 of the 4 walls. And the fourth wall was filled with windows. It was the exterior wall. The other 3 walls were literally covered in books from floor to ceiling, probably 8 to 10 shelves per stack, and 5 to 6 stacks on each wall. And I looked and I said to him in one of my first visits, "Oh, Your Grace, so many books. There must be 4 or 5 thousand books here in your library." And he said, "Oh, yes, but you can only see the half of them. Every bookshelf had double books. They were super deep, and he had books behind books." And so he actually had more like 10,000 books in his library and not just 5 that I could see. So it was quite an impressive place. The other thing I did was from lecture series to lecture series, I would move the furniture around a bit. So there was a bit different backdrop for each one. So it looked like we were in a different studio, but it was all in his house. And it was always with him and his back to the books and his face to the windows so that I could use the natural light for the video cameras. And that was how I put these lectures together. And in total, we are in the process of transcribing them into books. And I've come up with 16 different topics and over 100 lectures that we're organizing into 5 book topics. And each book is going to be 250 to 300 pages when they're finally published.
Yes. Awesome. Well, to those listening, I've got a question for you. Which ones do you want to hear next? We seem to have a bunch of them. I'm going to try to line up Great Lent with the Lenten series. But if there's 7 of them, I might have to double up.
Ah, there's one I actually overlooked that would be perhaps perfect for that, and that is there was one. It's called Journey to Pascha, Zacchaeus to Pentecost,
Mm.
and that one was not lectures, but it was his prepared notes for homilies at his parish. So each one is shorter, but they are specific to all the Sundays of the Eastern calendar, from the Sunday of Zacchaeus all the way through Lent to Pascha to Pentecost. And I think it ends on the Sunday of All Saints, which is the Sunday after Pentecost. So that would be one to have during Pascha, where every week is the week that is coming in the calendar.
And that's what we shall do.
Yeah. Good, glad you mentioned it.
Absolutely. All right. Is there anything else?
That's it. That pretty much covers all of his. We're working on the transcriptions, and I hope we'll have an announcement here in the next few months that all of these lectures are going to be available in print form as well.
All right. Well, then, I guess that concludes the topic for this episode. Next week, we will be talking about and overviewing Archimandrite Robert Taft in his lectures for the Orientale Lumen Foundation. To those listening, thank you again for coming back and participating and being a part of this community. And thank you. God bless. Bye-bye.